In this video, we show you how to install an ME4012, ME4024, ME412, or ME424 enclosure in a rack using toolless rails. Before you begin, ensure that the pre-assembled rails are the correct length for the rack in which you are installing the enclosure. Ensure that the rail pins on the front and back of the rails are the correct pins for the type of rack you are using. The rails are shipped from the factory with pins for racks with universal square holes or standard round holes. If you're using a rack with smaller holes, remove the existing pins from the rails and install the pins that correspond to your rack. Next, identify the rack holes to use when installing the rails in the racks. Insert the rail pins on the rear of the left rail into the rack holes of the rear rack post. Ensure that the snap latch locks into place on the rear rack post. Extend the left rail to fit between the front and rear rack posts. Then insert the rail pins on the front of the left rail into the rack holes of the front rack post. Ensure that the snap latch locks into place on the front rack posts. Then repeat the previous steps to install the right rail into the rack. With the rails installed, use two people to lift the enclosure and align it with the installed rails. Ensure that the enclosure remains level while installing it in the rack. Carefully insert the inner rail on each side of the enclosure into the rails. Then push the enclosure fully into the rack. At this point, secure the enclosure to the rack using the enclosure fastening screws on the rack mount ears on the left and right side of the enclosure. This completes the process. For more information or support about an ME4 Series enclosure, visit dell.com/support.